Hey everybody, this is Meyer, and this is going to be the track walkthrough of my submission to the SynthMaster 2021 track contest for my track titled 138. Thanks for everyone who voted for me, and if I get first place, I'll go ahead and release this project file so you guys can download it and see everything. Also, if you haven't heard the track, go ahead and listen to it. I'll provide links in the description for that. What I'm going to be doing through this is deconstructing the sounds that I made, because I made all of these sounds from scratch, and explaining kind of how I process them. So let's first start over here at bar 9, where the kick and sub come in. And I want to start by just going through the kick, sub, and the mid basses first, because this kind of provides the backbone of the track. So this is the kick by itself. And not really a lot going on here, basically just a tiny bit of boost in the high end on the EQ. And this filter is a low pass filter that I automate sometimes when the kick comes in or comes out. Balance just for automating volume. And this LFO tool isn't doing anything. It's just kind of an oscilloscope, so I see how long the kick is relative to each beat. So adding in the sub bass and the kick and sub together. Very simple. All the sub is it's basically a 1 octave sawtooth wave, or a sawtooth wave 1 octave below, going through a low pass filter. And what I've done here, and I couldn't use the sub oscillator for this because I needed these both to be phase retriggered, is I added a sine wave, and what I did with this sine wave is I adjusted the phase so it's bolstering the fundamental frequency of the sawtooth wave. So listen to this this sound, and I'll bring in this sine wave. And I had to adjust the phase so it's actually in phase with that sawtooth wave. So as you can see, it's just really bolstering that fundamental frequency. And then what I've done here with the EQ is just taken out some of the high and dip some of these mids down so it's not so nasally. Which to me gives it a little bit of warmth. Then there's going through an LFO tool, which just is there to keep it from hanging over into the next bar and interfering with the kick, because the kick's going to hit here and then the sub's going to hit on the offbeat, so halfway through. And together these are going through this to this bus, which isn't doing anything other than acting as an oscilloscope so we can see where the kick hits and where the sub hits. And other than that, just a high cut filter at 30 or 28 hertz, just so we don't have any of that low frequency information eating up our headroom here. Let's go ahead and add the mid basses. This is what they all sound like together. The first mid bass is completely in mono, and this is like our solid bass. If you look at it, it's 1 octave, or basically 1 sawtooth wave that's phase retriggered, and then 5 voices in unison on another sawtooth wave that are free running. It's really important if you're doing these things in unison to have them be free running, otherwise it doesn't sound very good. Basically, they'll all start at the same time, so you'll get these weird clicks. And what this is doing is just adding some of that high end, a little bit of a click to the sound. And then just some EQ, boosting some of the low mid. This is going through distortion and a compressor here on SynthMaster. Then moving on to the second mid bass, this is what gives it a lot of the sides. So if you look what I've done here, it's another sawtooth wave. This time it's free running, and then it's 8 voices in unison of sawtooth wave with a lot of width to it. So together, this is actually going to be a lot louder than this, because one of the things that happens when you add the voices in SynthMaster 1, what ends up happening is you're basically adding copies of the sound. So this is going to be 8 sawtooth waves, and this is going to be just 1. So even though the volume here is higher, you're not really hearing this as much. This is basically acting as a sub oscillator to this, which is pushing the sound out to the side. Doesn't sound very good on its own, but listen to mid bass 1 with and without the second one playing. It's subtle, but it's pushing it out to the sides a little bit and making it a little bit more interesting. And you'll see a lot of guys doing this. Like I know Giuseppe Ottaviani does this. I think Vinny Vici also does this, where they'll have one bass, which is kind of the solid main bass right down the middle, basically in mono. And then you have these other mid basses, which are there to give it some more side information. Then we move on to a third mid bass. This is the MIDI's doing something different, so rather than just 3/8 notes on the same octave, this is the one that's actually bouncing up and down like this. And what this sound is it's basically more sawtooth waves that are detuned with some stereo information. So the way I describe it, mid bass 1, mono, right down the center. Mid bass 2 is sides, but kind of the low mid sides. And mid bass 3 is sort of the high end sides, especially because it's jumping octaves. So this is like more like a flavor bass that's adding to the top end. Next thing I want to go through, I have two acids going on here in the track. You can see they're right here. Let's take a listen to what they're doing. Some EQ and sidechain. So this first one, it's basically some sawtooth waves with width. Notice how there's no detune, but there is width. So because they're free running, it's basically gonna, the one on the left and the one on the right, because this width is all the way out, basically there's gonna be one sawtooth wave all the way to the left, one all the way to the right, and they're gonna start at different phases. So this is what gives it some stereo information. And then the sound, this is just one right down the middle so that there's some coherency in the middle as well. And it's this distortion. Basically, it's a bandpass filter that these things are running through with high resonance going through distortion. So without the distortion, it doesn't sound that great. Then what I did, besides EQ to shelf off some of the low end, I'm having it go through this delay. Delay is what really pushes it around, and then the compressor after the delay to glue the delay to the sound. So this compressor makes sure that the delay has more consistent volume, so it actually stays with the sound a little bit more. If I didn't have this compressor here, the delay would start out much louder and overlap with the sound, and it would die off a lot quicker. So this compressor is basically there to tame the delay and make it actually part of the sound. So you can hear that delay is like really important. This is just, it's kind of this whole acid sound is pretty gritty and it's really pushed down in the background, but playing it with the mid basses, you can hear it. The second acid, this one's kind of the more of the main acid. You'll see what it is. It's basically sawtooth wave along with a pulse wave or square wave that's an octave lower. Once again, going through, this time it's a low pass filter, but there is a high pass filter that I'm using here on the EQ section going through distortion. So very common to see some sort of filter with high resonance, often a bandpass filter, going through high resonance and then followed by the distortion. And that's kind of what gives these acid sounds their kind of grittiness. Notice how the sound is completely in mono, so the only thing that's going on in the stereo field is this delay. So without the delay, and one piece of advice I'll give when you're doing sound design like this, keep in mind what your delay setting is going to be at is going to depend on the MIDI. So with this one, I went with 1/8 note delay. And the reason for this is if you notice what these notes are doing for this acid, it's almost doing dotted notes. So this one's going to hit, and then what's going to happen is this is where the eighth note hits. This is where the delay is going to be hitting it. So it's going to hit here, 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 going to hit here, and going to hit here. So that's pretty important to see where the notes are going to hit and selecting the delay accordingly. I think if I selected dotted eighth note, the delay would hit here, and then it would hit here when I'm already playing the note. So in this case, to me, it made more sense to use a complete eighth note delay, but you can do either one. With this first acid, I actually used dotted eighth note delay. And if we look at the MIDI for that, once again, these are playing eighth. It's basically straight eighth notes, eighth note, then 16th notes, eighth note, eighth note. So for this sound, it made more sense. You can hear the kind of syncopation that it's adding to this, because without that delay, it's pretty straight and maybe even pretty boring. Listen to it without the delay. And then both of these acids together. And what I do here is I kind of play the cutoffs off of each other. So when one's high, the other one's not really that high. When the other one's high, then the other one's a little bit lower. You see that particularly here during the second section of the drop when I add both of the acids back in. The first acid here, the cutoff is going up while the second one's going down. Then they kind of switch. Pretty cool. Then I'm going to move on to the intro pluck. You can hear what this sounds like. Pretty straight, pretty basic sound. Now what's really doing it to this sound is the effects here, because on its own, all it is one voice saw wave. So without any of the effects, pretty basic sound. Not a bad sound, it's just straightforward. Distortion and EQ. So let's see what these effects are doing. High boost and a cut around 800 hertz. Sometimes you'll find that these plucks can get muddy around 800 hertz, so sometimes it makes sense to dip that a little bit, and then the energy maybe around 400 hertz to boost that a little bit, which I'm doing slightly. Then it's going to an eighth note delay, because once again, if we look at what the MIDI's doing, these are dotted eighth notes. Bump, 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 bump. Actually, dotted eighth, and then restarting. So this syncopation with the delay. Filling it out. Then it's going through Envoy's delay. Unfortunately, the GUI isn't loading, so I actually had to pick the preset directly from here and use the dry wet directly in FL Studio. This is what Sean Tyas would call the most used preset in trance. I had to select it through here, and this is what it sounds like. It gives it a lot of movement. So it's basically delay lines with auto pan on the delay line and a high resonance filter. I think it's a low pass filter. It might be a band pass filter. I guess we can't tell, but you can hear it kind of gives the sound a lot of movement, a lot of interest to it. Then going through reverb, which is very slight. Sidechain with the LFO tool. And this is basically, it's an automated filter cut off some of the high end, and you hear that being used at the beginning. Very, very subtle, but just allows us to kind of bring it in a little bit. Now let's go ahead and we've gone through these sounds. Let me go through the effects really quick before I move on to the sort of bread and butter sounds that we have, like the leads and pads and stuff. So a couple things. The first thing, I have two sweeps going on. These are both made, you'll find, just using these basic waveforms, I had to engage oscillator 1, but since oscillator 1 wouldn't let me select noise, I had to turn the volume all the way down and use the sub oscillator with white noise. And you'll find white noise is just incredibly powerful for all sorts of things like this. There are two sweeps with this. The first one is a bandpass filter, so it's just white noise going through a bandpass filter. And one of the things I did, take a look at this, I set both of the sub oscillators to white noise and I panned one hard left and one hard right. And since it's basically white noise, that's free running, it's not phase retriggered, you end up getting a sound like this. So just a simple effect, and I'm using the built-in reverb in SynthMaster 1. The second sweep is very similar. If you notice what I did here, it's once again the same thing with noise, except this one's a low pass filter followed by a high pass filter. So this also is basically making a bandpass filter, but here I can adjust the spacing between the two filters a little bit more, and they're both mapped to the mod wheel here with the mod matrix. So this is what this one sounds like. Go ahead and turn this off because it's actually going through the same LFO tool. This one is routed through sweep 1. So together, let me just play them both together really quickly. Pretty cool. Then I have this sub drop here. You'll hear it occasionally when the drum fill comes in. And all this is just a swept sine wave with a pitch envelope. So I'm mapping mod envelope 1 to the pitch of oscillator 1 with a sine wave, and then I can basically play it like an instrument. But take a listen what this sounds like on its own. Play it here. So with the fills, because I have these drum fills that I've kind of chopped up, and in context, it just kind of gives it a little bit of low end. Let's see if you can hear it without it. Just kind of signals to the listener that something's coming, so I use that in combination with these fills pretty often. And the last effect that I've synthesized here, besides these drum samples and stuff, is just it's a pitch riser. So what this sounds like is like this. It's basically a big old supersaw. Sorry, that's a sub drop. This is the riser. It's a giant supersaw with another one an octave lower. And then what I've done is mapped the actual pitch bend wheel to the filter cutoff and the reverb amount. So as the pitch wheel moves up, it's actually going to open the filter and it's going to wash out the sound a little bit more. So take a listen. Oh, and I have to, oh. And the thing I like about this is as it opens, you actually hear it kind of the tail wash over the end, starting the next bar. So it starts really low and then just kind of opens up and rises in pitch at the same time. And that works really well, especially here when we start opening the pads up here at the intro, because what ends up happening is these pads are playing and you can hear them kind of playing off the riser. Let's start it here. So with that being said, let's take a look at the pads. I'm using the same pads during the drop and the breakdown. One thing that's worth mentioning, I do have some reverb on the pads, but that's only for the intro and the breakdown. During the actual drop, I turn this reverb off. You can see here I have the pads reverb amount. It's playing through the breakdown, and then as soon as the drop hits, there's no reverb on the pads at all. And that was because to me they sounded a little bit dry because there's not really much else going on when they're playing here, but when the drop comes in, I didn't want them to get too muddy with the leads. You can find that mixing trance can be very difficult because everything's washed over in reverb. So I kind of took the route of not using any reverb on the pads. This is a trick I got from Reorder, and it's a really good trick because there's no reason to just have that mud there if it's not contributing to anything. Pads are just basically paddy, so they basically already sound like they have reverb. There are two pads. There's this first one, which to me sounds like kind of like your typical Airwave super saw pad. It's bunch of saws, 8 pretty open, and then just going through some EQ. This EQ is really helping. Once again, boosting the mids where the pad's going to help sit and fill out the spectrum. We don't want a lot of the low information because this is where the sub and the kick are, and we don't want it to interfere with the leads either, even though we do want it to be bright. Then once again here you see low cut and a little boost in the high end, and then it's going through this mag EQ, which is basically just here to give it a little bit of top end sparkle. I'm using the 20 kilohertz setting on the air band. Probably doesn't even need this mag EQ to be honest, but I added it anyway. Listen to the second pad. Once again, very similar, although I'm boosting a little bit of a different frequency so they're not overlapping too much and cutting some of the high end out because I found this pad in particular could be kind of brittle on its own. So let's see. So again, pretty straightforward. Once again, a lot of saws, except this one, it's going up an octave rather than down an octave. And we're adding some white noise to the sound with the sub oscillator, which just kind of helps it just sound a little, I guess, fizzier and sound a little bit, give it a little bit more sparkle. I guess that's the word I'd use. Going through this low pass filter. I'm not actually automating the mod wheel on these pads. What I'm doing is I'm automating the high cut on this EQ. So if you listen to when these pads come in, you'll see I actually automate this. And what's going on here leading up, I'm only using the first pad, I'm not using the second one. And then when they both come in here at bar 25, they're both playing, which gives it a little bit, kind of gives it a little bit of a lift, I'd say. Same thing here during the breakdown. We have these, we got these pads opening up as well. Speaking of pads, I also have a sub pad here. This is basically just playing the bass notes. So it does what the sub would have done, but no offbeat and just the low sub octave. And this is just done really simple, 3 octave three voice sawtooth wave with a little bit of width and a little bit of detune. And this is what this sounds like with a high cut. So all of these together, you can hear it when the pads start opening. So let's go ahead and move on to the lead sounds that I have. So there's actually deceptively more leads than you'd think, but they're all doing different stuff. So what I have is there are three main leads, but one of them, what I've done is I've split the top and the bottom notes into separate patterns. So looking at lead one, there's lead one, and then there's lead one for the low notes. And this allows me to adjust the volume of the low notes separately from the high notes. And it also allows me to adjust what the main difference between these are very similar sounds is if you look here, it's the release. So for the low notes, notice how there's less amp release than here. There's also slightly less filter cutoff on the bottom notes because I turn the key track down versus the top notes. So that just keeps the low notes from being too bright. And this is what the first lead sounds like. Actually, let me play it when they're open. You can hear them. So just the low notes. And these are the top notes. And together. And let me actually play the sound naked so you can hear it. So this is without any of the processing I've done. A little bit of high boost. So without the reverb and the delay, it's really dry. I mean, that's what it sounds like on its own. And when you're designing these sounds, I think there's a tendency to almost want to increase the release a lot or make them really fill out when your reverb's going to do that for you, your delay is going to do that for you, and these are arpeggiated, so you want to keep these notes pretty short, but you also don't want them to be so short that it sounds cheesy. So that's why you do need some release. In fact, when you look here, it's actually quite a bit of release just because the curve is so exponential, or so, I guess, that'd be convex. Anyway, you kind of get the idea. Then we move on to the second lead. Now what this is doing, this one's just playing the top notes, and this has, the notes are a little bit longer and the release is a little bit more. Once again, big old super saws with some white noise added. What this lead is allowing us to do is it's helping differentiate those top notes, which are really important, from the bottom notes, which are arpeggiated. So that's one of the reasons I really like it. So it's basically playing these notes, but a little bit longer and at a higher octave. And last but not least, we have our third lead. Originally, I just had these two, and then I came back listening to it later, and I was like, it's missing something. So what this third lead is doing is it's just providing more high end. I found that there was already enough low end, and you'll hear it when I add the plucks as well. And what this, once again, what this third lead is doing is just, once again, much higher octaves, a lot more unison, and going through this EQ where we're basically just taking out some of the mids. So this is, once again, a little bit more release, but played with the other leads. With the more of that release there on lead 3, I think it helps accentuate the notes and almost articulates them a little bit more. So as lead 1 is a little bit shorter, a little bit pluckier, lead 3 is a little bit more smooth, and that kind of helps it cut through. It's almost like a linear curve that starts when the note hits, plucks down, and then keeps plucking after the note is released. Let's go ahead and add these plucks, because the plucks are also going to the leads bus. There's this first pluck. Let's play this on its own. What? Where is it? Oh, I have to have this on. That's why. Once again, you can see what I did. I separated this pluck to a low version and the upper octave version. So really the difference here is so I can control the volume. I think I just turned the low pluck notes down a little bit. This is playing the same thing as the first lead. It's just a more plucky sound with the filter. And this is something that I remember Alan Morrow was talking about. It can help to layer your leads with a pluck sound to help bring that attack in. And this comes in handy, especially when we're triggering the compressor that I have on the lead as well. So you can see here, really basic sound. One oscillator sawtooth wave that's phase retriggered going through a low pass filter. It's almost hard to hear with these leads. But what it's really adding here is this information in the low mid. And once again, a cut around 800 Hertz, keep things from getting too muddy. Then we move on to the second pluck, which is really subtle, but it's important because this is the only sound that's actually playing different intervals. It's very different than the other notes. It's playing the same top note pattern, but here I added a minor third. Here the note is layered with a fifth. This is basically a fourth. So take a listen to what this sounds like. And it's very similar to the first pluck sound. It's just one octave sawtooth wave, but completely different sound made completely from scratch. This case, it's using the mod envelope to get that plucky sound. So layered with the first pluck. So it's basically turning this top lead into almost a chord when they're being played, or at least some sort of intervals, and played with the rest of the leads. Can barely hear it, but you can tell it's just adding a little bit of extra something, a little bit of extra, that extra note there just kind of helps the harmonics. So let's go ahead and take a look at what processing I'm doing on all the leads. This is probably the most intense processing I've done on any of these channels. First thing is dotted eighth note delay. Just a little bit, very subtle. Then it's going through an EQ, take out the low end. Now this low end amount is automated, so during the breakdown, it allows that low end to come through. So when we don't have the sub and the kick playing, it allows that low end to come through, whereas when the drop happens, we take out more of the low end to make room for the kick and the mid bass. Now it's going through the Waves SSL comp. This is a really famous compressor. This is also known as a glue compressor. And what I've done here is given it a little bit of attack to let those transients through and then squash the rest of the sound. Now, usually what you'd see me do is you'd see me use this compressor before and after the reverb. The one after the reverb helping glue the reverb to the sound. I tried it there and it didn't sound as good this time after the reverb as well, so I only kept it before. So what's really going on here, what I can hear with this compressor, is it's triggering when the top notes are coming through and letting those in a little bit more, and then evening out the dynamics of the bottom notes. And that's thanks to this 10 milliseconds of attack. So those notes are able to push through and it kind of makes them a little bit more plucky. And then with the release set, it basically squashes the rest of everything so the levels aren't going all over the place. Then we go to Arts Acoustic Reverb, one of my favorite reverb plugins. Just beautiful. I mean, really makes it sound like it's in some sort of arena and gives it that anthemic, is that a word? Like an anthem. Really important. Then it goes to the LFO tool. For the drop. Then it's going through this ozone imager. This is really, really important to the sound. It's basically making everything below 150 hertz completely mono, but the rest of these I've boosted the stereo field, especially in the high range. And it sounds to me, and you'll hear this too, like you just took a blanket off of the leads. It's allowing more of that stereo information and it pushes them to the sides and it just makes it sound that much more full. So take a listen with it off. And now with it on. And because this reverb is so wide, you can see it's set to this open type, it's actually increasing the volume of the reverb too. Once again, really, really, to me, adding to the sound a lot. And if you're listening to this on stereo speakers or headphones, you'd probably hear exactly what I'm talking about here. Fantastic plugin, this Ozone Imager. I mean, really, really love this thing. And then last but not least, a Mag EQ4 with all I'm doing is boosting this airband at 40 kilohertz and really gentle high shelf. And one of the reasons I love this EQ is its curves are so gentle. It allows you to get away with more of a boost that gives it a bit of a shine without it sounding harsh. So take a listen. And together with the pads, which once again don't have the reverb and also have the Mag EQ. Actually, let's do this without this stuff. And now we're gonna move to my favorite sound, which really is what brings this track to life, which is what I call this key. It starts at the beginning, and the one in the intro and during the drop are the same one, which is this main key. But I want to start with the one in the breakdown first. All it is one oscillator sawtooth wave with a lot of release, and it's once again has some envelope here on the filter, so it kind of, as I open the filter, it gives it more of a tone. So this is what it sounds like. Let me take these delays off. And I slowly open the filter on this one. You can see here's the breakdown top key, which is this one. So as soon as it comes over here. And what's, I think, adding to the sound a lot and keeping it from sounding so static or feeling so static is this vibrato. You can see here I added some attack and increased the speed. So what's going on here, the note hits and then the vibrato doesn't come in until a little bit after the note hits, and it's affecting that tail as it dies out. That's going through this delay, which is set to ping pong at dotted eighth notes. really important for that stereo image. A low cut. I'm not using the Omniboy's delay on this one in the breakdown, but I am using the Arts Acoustic Reverb. Same preset as the leads, but I'm just turn the wet down a little bit. So that's this one during the breakdown, whereas this one during the drop, it's the same basic sound, except now this filter is open a lot more, and you can see the mod envelope is adjusting that a little bit more. So notice when it's open, it sounds completely different. Turn all this stuff off. Sounds almost analog because of that pitch drift. Once again, the same delay, dotted eighth note delay. The one that's playing during the drop and during the intro has a high cut filter applied. And one thing that's adding to the sound too, I have a triangle wave that's playing an octave lower because this is a sawtooth wave pitched an octave up. So what this triangle wave is doing is acting actually as a sub oscillator. You see me use a sub oscillator for pretty much everything but a sub oscillator. And here I'm actually using it as a sub oscillator to kind of beefing up the sound a little bit. And then it goes through this Omniboy's delay, really important to the sound. Arts Acoustic Reverb again. And the one that's playing in the intro and the drop is also going through the Mag EQ, as well as this balance, which is just here for volume automation. I decrease the volume ever so slightly here during the intro part, but listen to it with the Mag EQ. Very slight, only half a dB of gain at 2.5 kilohertz and a slight bit of this error gain at 40 kilohertz. This seems like a lot. You're like, oh my gosh, it's 2 dB. But you got to keep in mind, this is a very gentle slope that's centered around 40 kilohertz. And the upper range of our hearing is 20 kilohertz. So it's just really, really gentle and really gives it that sparkle. And then during the intro, the only thing I've done differently, if we look at the automation, is I've just decreased the cutoff. And one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the MIDI here, it's really spaced out. And that allows the delay and the reverb to kind of wash over. So occasionally I play notes in quick succession, but then I give it a lot of space. And when this is played with the leads are playing very constantly every 16th note, whereas this is allowed to hit at certain points and then wash over at other points. Let me play this with the leads so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. And I'll play it with the kick and sub as well. The last thing I'll say is the only other stuff I've added here are percussion, and I don't want to spend too much time doing these because it's very, very simple percussion. I didn't spend a lot of time doing this because the main important piece is the synths, and that's why I want to do this walkthrough. But really quickly, let me talk about what each of these percussion pieces are. So obviously you have the kick. If you notice the processing on the kick, there's no compression, nothing like that. This sample was fine the way it was. So I see a lot of guys out there, compressing the crap out of things. And if your sample's already compressed, which there's a good chance it is, you want to make sure your compression's actually doing something. You can actually hear what it's doing, and you're doing it for a reason. I think we have this tendency to just, because we can slap all these plugins on things, but if it's not adding to the sound, if it's not doing anything, if it's not improving the sound, then don't do it. You're actually going to end up distorting a sound that was fine to begin with. And you'll hear a lot of producers talk about this. They'll go to their projects where they've put a bunch of these plugins on, and they'll turn them all off, and then it'll sound better with it all off, because there's no reason to just pile all this stuff on that's going to make it end up sounding worse than just have the natural sound breathe. Anyway, that's enough of my rant. Take a listen. There's a couple claps. There's actually 3 claps going on. This is the first one. So this first clap, really like the tail of that, but I wanted to give it a different attack. So the second clap, there's actually 2 pieces. There's this one, kind of mid-heavy, and this one, almost like a 909 sort of clap. So together, just talked about the compression. I actually had this compressor on it, and I turned it off because I didn't like what it was doing to the sound. You may think it sounds better with the compressor. And sometimes I'll use this LFO tool to just cut the initial attack of that clap down, just the first few milliseconds. That way when the kick hits, it's not overlapping with the clap. Sometimes you can run into issues with this. And I used to have all these issues trying to get the clap to sit with the kick. And I never knew it was as simple as just dipping out the first little bit using an LFO tool, because it's playing every 2 and 4 with the kick. Then closed hi-hat. If you look at the MIDI, I'm not actually using the velocities. I'm using this LFO tool to actually give it the groove. So without the LFO tool, it's pretty boring. And with the LFO tool, really important for that groove. And then just going through an auto filter. I've added a little bit of the dry signal, but this is just high resonance sweeping up and down over, it says over a bar, but I think it's actually 2 bars. I guess it is over a bar, but just kind of giving it some movement so it's not doing the same thing. Then we move to one of the most important pieces in trance, which is the open hi-hat. Going through this SSL EQ from Waves, and then just a slight boost. And then here with the ride, which the ride has a little bit of reverb and a little bit of sidechain on it. Let's hear it by itself. Ever so slight. And I use this whenever I want to add more energy. So you'll see this here. First 16 bars of the drop, no ride. Second 16 bars. So actually, let me play it from back here so you can hear what I'm talking about. Then I actually have 4 loops. This is kind of overkill, but all that's on them are just LFO tools. This is the first one. Let me actually play this by itself with the kick. And I've kind of chopped some of these up a little bit and rearranged where the notes are. Second loop. This one's more high, heavy. Loop 3. This one's pretty heavy sidechain, but this has more of the low information. And then this last one's like a shaker. It's like a shaker loop. So all together. And with the closed hat. And what I've done in some of these is I've taken the velocities of some of these notes down, especially these ones where it sounds like there's already an open hi-hat in the loop. Because I don't want it to clash with the open hi-hat that I'm actually adding. So this is loop 2. On its own, it doesn't sound all that great, but when you add in the open hi-hat, adds that drive. And that's one thing that's really important. When you start getting more experience producing, you'll realize that you don't need everything to sound good on its own. You just need it to sound good in context. That's one of the things I'd say about the mid basses of this track. If you listen to them together, they're probably not the best sounding mid basses you've ever heard in your life. Like, listen to them. Or during this part, maybe. Maybe sound thin. When you don't have the sub bass playing, but in context of everything else, you know they're missing when they're not playing. You know they're really important to the sound. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys learned something. And once again, thank you all so much for voting for me in the track contest. And well, I guess thanks for everyone who participated. You didn't have to vote for me to have a great track or to learn something from this video, but hope it was helpful. Hope you guys got a little bit of insight into how I did this. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.